I remember the night, like it was carved into my bones. The sky thick with clouds that refused to move. The wind whispering promises I didn't understand yet. I walked through the empty streets knowing something was waiting for me. Something patient. Something that had been counting my footsteps long before I even realized it. I could hear the bells from the old cathedral ringing far off, broken, each clang vibrating through my chest like a drum marking the end of innocence. I should have turned back then, should have run screaming into the darkness. But curiosity, or maybe something older, pulled me forward. The streets were slick with rain that smelled of iron and earth, and every reflection in the puddles seemed wrong, warped, as if the night itself was bending to watch me. When I reached the cathedral doors, they were cracked and rotting, blackened with age and something that looked like old blood. I pushed them open, and the smell hit me first, a mixture of wax and decay, and something sharp that made my teeth ache. The interior was darker than the night outside, the stained glass fractured and half fallen, but there was a light, dim and golden, coming from the altar. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel the weight of eyes, too many eyes, pressing into me from the shadows. The floorboards moaned under my feet, each step echoing like a heartbeat in a chest made of stone. Then I saw it. A book lying on the altar, bound in leather so black it swallowed the light around it. The edges frayed like it had been dragged through 1,000 storms. The cover was blank except for a series of symbols that made my skin crawl. I reached for it, and the air turned heavy, as if the building itself was breathing. And then I heard the voice, not in words, not in sound, but in thought, piercing, intimate, older than the city, telling me to take it, that it had waited for me, that the priestess knew, and that by holding it, I had already agreed. I wanted to drop it. I wanted to leave. But my hands did not obey. The book lifted itself into my arms, and when I opened it, the first page burned into my mind, a face I recognized yet had never met, smiling faintly. And I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. The first page looked blank at first, but as I stared, words began to crawl across it like worms in soft soil, letters I didn't recognize, yet somehow I understood them. They spoke of things older than memory, of priests who walked the earth not as shepherds, but as guardians of a secret so vast it could swallow humanity whole. And beneath the text, a photograph appeared, flickering like a candle struggling against wind, a man in a cassock standing in a small chapel, his face calm, almost gentle, yet his eyes were hollow, as if he already knew the shape of his death. I shivered, trying to look away, but my fingers traced the edge of the page, drawn to it as if by blood. I could hear whispers in the silence, soft at first, like someone breathing behind a wall, then louder, urgent, telling me names, places, dates, all of it arranged as if someone had been preparing me, training me without my knowledge. I didn't want this. I wanted to throw the book across the cathedral, but when I looked up, the doors were gone, replaced by a solid wall of shadows that shifted as I moved, and I understood that leaving was no longer an option. The voice returned, clearer now, curling around my thoughts like smoke. It told me that the man in the photograph would die, that it was necessary, and that the moment his life ended, another page would fill, revealing more than I could bear to know. I tried to resist. I told myself it was impossible, that this was some cruel hallucination, yet the book pulsed in my hands, heavier with expectation. I felt it urging me, promising understanding, and fear twisted inside me, sharp and cold. I realized then that this was a contract I never signed, yet could not refuse. Outside the cathedral, the city seemed to hold its breath, street lamps flickering as if the world itself was watching, and inside, the air thickened, pressing against my skin, almost solid. The first priest's name burned into my mind, the photograph moving slightly, lips curling into a faint smile that I could not place. I hated myself for seeing it. I hated myself more for feeling that smile was meant for me, as if the devil himself had counted it before I had. I left the cathedral that night carrying the book, every shadow in the street stretching toward me, every face in the windows turning away as if they knew, and I understood that my life was no longer mine, that each step forward was already written, and that the moment I acted, the first of 19 smiles would be claimed, and I would never be the same. I found him 2 nights later, Father Mallory, kneeling in a chapel that smelled of incense and old stone, the light from the candles flickering against his face, his eyes closed in prayer, unaware of the fate already written. My hands shook as I held the book, its leather warm, almost alive, as if it fed on my fear. The photograph on the first page had shifted, now showing him in the same position, the faint smile still etched in shadows across his lips. I wanted to run, to scream, to throw the book into the river and disappear, but the voice returned, insistent, curling around my mind, telling me the truth, telling me that every priest was a lock, every life a key, and that unless I opened them, the world would remain blind. I tried to speak, to warn him, but when he opened his eyes, it was as if he saw through me, a recognition that made my stomach turn. There was no fear, only something older, deeper, a knowledge of the book and what it demanded. He stood, calm, reaching for the crucifix on the wall, and I realized he was not trying to defend himself. He was preparing for what I could not yet understand. And then the knife appeared in his hand, sudden, precise, and I moved, reacting before thought. The struggle was brief, the violence intimate. And when it ended, he was on the floor, the candlelight reflecting off the small pool of blood that had begun to spread like ink on old parchment. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to leave. But the book shifted in my arms, heavier now, and I felt the first page thrum like a heartbeat, the text changing, filling with new symbols, and I knew that it had counted, that the first of 19 smiles had been claimed, and I was no longer merely a man. I was a participant, a witness, a servant of something vast and unseen. Outside, the night had changed, the wind howling through the city with a voice that mimicked laughter. Inside me, a hollow emptiness settled. The knowledge that 19 deaths lay ahead, each one a key, each one a step deeper into a darkness that could not be escaped. I left the chapel quietly, the smell of wax and iron clinging to my clothes, the streets stretching out in silence. But I knew the shadows followed, waiting, counting, and that somewhere the devil had smiled, waiting for me to continue. And I understood fully, with a terror that rooted itself in my chest, that I could never go back, that the first priest was only the beginning, and that each smile would come at a cost far higher than I could imagine. I didn't sleep that night, the city's quiet pressing against my skull, each distant siren, each whisper of wind against the buildings like a warning I couldn't ignore. The book lay open on my kitchen table, its pages fluttering as if impatient, and I could see the second photograph slowly forming, Father Larkin, in a cathedral on the edge of town, his hands folded in prayer, his lips moving silently, reciting words that carried weight I could feel in my chest. I wanted to close the book, to bury it, to burn it. But my body refused, guided by something far older than reason. I followed the photograph, the streets twisting unnaturally, familiar corners bending as if they had never existed before. And when I reached the cathedral, the doors swung open before I touched them. The air inside smelled of mildew and something sweeter, almost alive, a faint hum vibrating through the stone walls. I found him at the altar, polishing chalices, his movements slow and methodical, unaware of my presence. I whispered his name, my voice breaking in the vast emptiness, and his head lifted, eyes meeting mine, wide, recognizing not just me, but the inevitability that had followed him. I raised the book, and he nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting this. The knife appeared again, sharp, deliberate, glinting under the candlelight, and I knew then that hesitation was a luxury I could no longer afford. The struggle was brief, intimate, a dance of inevitability, and when it ended, he lay still, the smile on his face faint but unmistakable. The book's page thrummed violently, the ink spreading, letters twisting into forms I could not name, yet understood completely. I felt a chill as I realized that the world outside remained unaware, untouched. While inside, something ancient was awakening, counting, feeding, and I was the instrument, the conduit, the chosen hand. I left the cathedral with the second priest behind me, his life already absorbed into the book, and the night air felt heavier, the shadows longer. Stretching across streets that seemed to fold in on themselves, I could hear a distant laughter carried by the wind, faint, intimate, and I knew it was watching, waiting for the next, for the third, for the cascade that would lead me ever deeper into the unseen, the impossible, the place where 19 deaths were only the beginning, and I understood fully with a sickening certainty that once this had started, there would be no turning back, no redemption, only the counting, the smiles, and the book, patient, endless, and hungry. By the third priest, the city no longer felt like mine. The streets twisted into shapes that made my stomach turn, every corner hiding eyes that weren't there before, and every shadow seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't unhear. Father Caldwell was in a small, forgotten chapel on the outskirts, the kind of place people passed without a thought, yet it reeked of devotion, and something older, something patient. I entered quietly, feeling the air press against my skin, thick with expectation, and there he was, kneeling, praying, unaware of what had already been written. I raised the book slightly, and the page glowed faintly, the photograph forming, his lips moving in silent words, and I realized with a sinking dread that this was a ritual, and I was a willing participant. I wanted to run, to throw the book into the river, but the weight of it in my arms anchored me, heavier than the sum of my own fear. I whispered his name, and he looked up, eyes wide but not with fear, with understanding. The knife in my hand felt like an extension of the book itself, guiding, demanding, and I acted. The struggle, short, intimate, suffocating, and then he was on the ground, the faintest smile curling on his lips, and I knew the second and third pages would fill, revealing new horrors, symbols and words older than memory, and I read them, though I didn't want to, feeling each line like a cold finger tracing my spine. Outside, the city felt smaller, tighter, as if the act had reshaped the world, and inside me, the weight of 19 deaths pressed down, the knowledge of what was coming for each one growing heavier with every step. The book pulsed in my arms, a heartbeat I could not ignore, and I realized I was no longer merely a man. I was a vessel, carrying something ancient through the streets, through the lives of priests who had never asked for this fate. The wind outside carried a lard, utter faint, intimate, almost approving. And I understood then that the devil had already counted, smiling at the first, the second, the third, and would continue to smile with every step I took. The knowledge of what lay ahead twisted my mind, and I felt the first true crack of fear inside me, not for myself, but for the world that remained unaware, untouched, innocent. And I knew fully, with a terror that rooted deep, that 19 priests, 19 smiles, and this book were the beginning of something the world would never see coming, and that each action, each heartbeat, each photograph forming and fading, would pull me further, faster, deeper into a darkness that would not let go. Father Durant was in a chapel that smelled of rotting wood and old incense, the pews dusty, untouched for decades, and yet the air inside seemed alive, pressing against me as I stepped over the threshold, the book in my hands heavier with anticipation, its leather pulsing like a heartbeat. I could see the fourth photograph forming on the page, him standing by the altar, hands clasped, lips moving silently, a smile ghosting across his face that made my stomach twist. I didn't want this. I wanted to run, to throw the book into the river. But my body moved without asking, guided by a force older than anything I had known. He looked up as I entered, eyes calm but understanding, and I felt the weight of what was about to happen press into my chest. The knife felt heavy, foreign, a thing that belonged to the book and not to me. And I moved quickly, silently, the struggle intimate and unnerving, the act of violence feeling preordained, inevitable, as if I had rehearsed it in some shadowed corner of memory I couldn't remember. And when he fell, the smile lingered, faint, almost approving, and I knew the page would thrum, filling with words and symbols that twisted inside my mind like worms in wet earth. The book was alive, feeding, learning, and I could feel it counting, measuring, the distance between the first, second, third, and now fourth priests. 19 smiles, each one a step deeper into something I could not yet name. Outside, the city seemed to breathe differently, the shadows stretching longer, folding into alleys that did not exist. And the wind carried a laughter faint, intimate, approving. I realized then that the book was not just a record, not just a ledger. It was a machine, an organism, something ancient that had chosen me as its conduit, its hand in the world, every priest a lock, every death a key. And I was opening them one by one, the pattern becoming clear. Era, a web of inevitability and dread that spanned the country. And inside me, the first true understanding of the scale of what I had begun settled like stone, heavy and cold. I could not stop. And even if I wanted to, the book would not let me. I was already in its orbit, its pulse matching my own, its whispers in my mind growing louder, telling me names, dates, locations, guiding me toward the fifth priest, and I knew fully, with a terror that rooted itself in my chest and refused to leave, that 19 priests, 19 smiles, and this book were not merely a story, not merely horror, but a ritual older than cities, older than faith, older than memory itself, and every step I took would bring me further, faster, into the darkness that had chosen me. Father Halloway waited in a chapel tucked into a forgotten alley, the walls blackened by soot, the candles burning low and trembling, as if afraid of something unseen. I entered cautiously, the book in my arms vibrating faintly, like a pulse I could feel in my bones, and the fifth photograph had already begun to form, him kneeling, hands folded, head bowed, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. And I felt it again, the whispering, low at first, curling through the air like smoke, brushing against my skin. The voice older than anything I had known, older than the streets, the city, the night itself. It told me he was ready, that I had been chosen, and that each death would unravel a layer of reality I was not prepared to understand. Halloway looked up as I approached, eyes wide, recognizing both me and inevitability. He did not resist, his hands lifted as if in surrender, and I felt the knife in my grip hum, guided by the book's ancient will. The struggle was brief, intimate, almost ceremonial. And when it ended, he fell silently, the faintest smile lingering. And I heard it clearly this time, not in my mind but in the shadows around us. The city itself laughing softly, approvingly, counting, marking, a presence that had been waiting, watching, and now feeding. The page in the book throbbed, letters twisting and spiraling into forms I could read and understand, though they had no name, symbols older than memory, maps of tunnels beneath cities, stairways that did not exist in the world above, corridors lined with faces frozen in prayer, each one a guardian, a lock, a key. And I knew fully that the priests were more than men, more than shepherds. They were wards, caretakers of a secret no one had been meant to see, and the book, patient, relentless, had chosen me to open them, every step forward a deepening into a nightmare older than my understanding. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faintest of laughter through alleys, through empty streets. Following me as I left the chapel, I could feel it breathing, counting, smiling. And I understood for the first time that 19 priests, 19 deaths, 19 smiles were a ritual, not just of flesh, but of the mind, of reality itself, bending to something older, darker, and insatiable. And inside me, a hollow certainty settled that there would be no turning back, no mercy, and that every shadow I passed, every whisper in the city, was part of a pattern I could not yet fully see. The fifth priest gone, and the book pulsing, guiding, waiting for the sixth. By the sixth priest, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The city no longer felt real, streets folding into themselves, windows reflecting things that weren't there. And I could feel the book guiding my every step, pulsing with anticipation, the photograph forming before I even reached him. Father Greaves, in a small chapel at the edge of the river, kneeling before an altar that smelled faintly of blood and wax, his lips moving in silent prayer, the faintest smile already curling across his face. I wanted to resist, wanted to throw the book into the river and vanish. But the moment I lifted it, the air thickened, pressing against my chest. The shadows in the room seemed to lean closer, and I understood fully that resistance was no longer mine to offer. The knife guided itself in my hands, the struggle brief, intimate, ceremonial. And when it ended, he lay still, the book thrumming violently, letters twisting and forming shapes I could comprehend, yet had no name. Outside, the wind carried a low laughter, soft and approving, counting, marking, feeding, the weight of 19 deaths pressing down harder, heavier than before. I knew the seventh would be worse. The book whispering the name, the location, and the inevitability. Father Merrick, in a cathedral at the far side of town, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move unnaturally, congregants frozen in place, their eyes wide, unblinking. And I understood that the book's influence was not limited to the priest alone. The shadows, the whispers, the city itself bending to watch, the corridors folding, the streets breathing. The seventh death would not be clean. It would ripple through the world like a stone dropped into a black pond. I entered, the air alive, humming with expectation, the book heavy, guiding, counting, the photograph flickering on the page, showing him standing at the altar, faint smile that I felt more. I then saw the knife moved in my hands, not mine, the struggle short, intimate, and when it ended, the shadows shifted, moving as if they were feeding on the act, the page filling with letters and symbols, maps beneath cities, corridors of faces frozen in eternal prayer, the book revealing its full scope, showing me that the priests were not merely men, but parts of a prison. Locks and keys maintaining a secret humanity had never been meant to uncover, and I understood fully, with a cold certainty that rooted itself deep in my chest, that 19 priests, 19 smiles, were only the beginning, and the shadows, the city, the wind, were all participants in something far older, far darker than I could comprehend, and the sixth and seventh had opened a doorway I could not close. By the time I reached the eighth priest, the city itself felt like it was holding its breath, streets twisting in ways I knew I had never walked before, buildings bending inward as if watching, the book pulsing in my arms, heavier with every death, guiding me forward like a hand older than time itself. Father Albright was in a chapel where the shadows clung to the walls, thick and slow-moving, and when I stepped inside they shifted, making way, as if acknowledging my presence, the eighth photograph already formed on the page, him kneeling, head bowed, lips moving, the faint smile appearing. And I understood fully that each death was not just a tally, not just a ritual, but a release, a letting loose of something older, older than priests, older than cities, something that had been feeding, waiting, and now leaned forward with anticipation. The knife moved in my hands, guided by the book's insistence, the struggle brief, intimate, a dance with inevitability, and when it ended, The page throbbed violently, letters twisting into forms I could read but had no name for, corridors beneath the earth, tunnels that connected every chapel, every cathedral, every place of worship, and I realized that the priests were more than men. They were guardians, locks holding something beyond comprehension, and with each death, a doorway opened, and I was stepping through them all. The ninth priest, Father Keaton, waited in a cathedral where the air itself seemed wrong, candles trembling as if afraid, shadows moving unnaturally, and when I entered, I saw the congregation frozen mid-prayer, faces pale, lips moving without sound, and the photograph on the ninth page formed instantly, showing him at the altar, faint smile already present, the book thrumming violently in my hands, a heartbeat older than me, older than the world, guiding me, counting, demanding. And I understood the weight of what I had become, the knife in my hands no longer mine, the act of violence inevitable, intimate, almost ceremonial. And when it ended, the ninth page filled, symbols twisting, letters forming maps beneath cities, corridors lined with faces frozen in prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, and the laughter returned, carried on the wind, soft, approving, intimate. And I knew fully that 19 deaths, 19 smiles, were no longer a choice, no longer a possibility to resist, that each step forward pulled me deeper into a darkness I could not escape, the book alive, patient, insatiable, and I understood for the first time the enormity of what awaited, the 10th priest still ahead, and with him, the truth that I had been walking toward all along, the nightmare older than memory, older than humanity, waiting for its final act. Father Whitmore was in a cathedral perched on a hill, the kind that overlooked the city like a watchful eye, the stone walls slick with shadows that moved independently, and when I stepped inside, the air felt alive, heavy, pressing against my skin, the book pulsing violently, eager, guiding me forward with a force older than reason. The 10th photograph had already formed, him standing at the altar, hands clasped, lips moving, the faintest smile curling at the corners, and I felt the weight of everything. The first 8, the 9th, the unseen, the whispers in the streets, the shadows leaning, counting, approving. I whispered his name, my voice breaking in the vast emptiness. And he turned, eyes wide, recognition and inevitability flickering there. He did not resist, his hands lifting slightly as if surrendering to something I could not name. The knife in my hand felt like a part of the book itself, moving of its own accord, the struggle brief, intimate, inevitable. And when it ended, he fell silently, the smile lingering faintly, and the page throbbed, the letters twisting, symbols forming, maps beneath cities, corridors lined with faces frozen in eternal prayer. And I realized fully that the priests were not just men, not just guardians. They were locks, holding a truth the world was never meant to see. Each death had opened a doorway, each smile had been counted by something older, and now the 10th left the world changed, the shadows deeper, the wind carrying a faint laughter through streets that bent unnaturally. I felt it then, the book heavier than ever, the weight of knowledge pressing into my bones, the pull toward the final priest, the 19th smile, the inevitability that had been building since the first. The city itself seemed to fold, corridors appearing where none existed, and the whispers followed, telling names, places, urging me forward. The 10th. Death a warning, a promise, a reminder that once this began, there would be no mercy, no escape, only the counting, the smiles, the pages, and I understood fully, with a terror that settled in my chest like stone, that the final priest would reveal what the book truly demanded, that the darkness was patient, insatiable, ancient, and that every act I had committed had been leading towards something I could not yet comprehend, and the 11th, 12th, all the way to 19th, awaited. And I was already caught in the orbit of something older than reason, older than the world, and with each step forward, each priest, each death, the city, the shadows, and the book pulsed with approval, guiding me toward the final act, toward the truth that I had been running from, toward the moment when 19 smiles would be counted and nothing would ever be the same. Father Sutherland awaited in a cathedral whose walls seemed to breathe, shadows crawling along the stone like living things, and the book pulsed in my hands, heavier than ever, its pages trembling as the 11th photograph formed, him kneeling at the altar, lips moving, a faint smile etched across his face that made my chest tighten with dread. I wanted to run, to throw the book into the void, but my body moved without asking, guided by a force older than the streets, older than the city, older than me. The knife lifted, sharp, alive in my hands, the struggle brief, intimate, inevitable. And when it ended, he fell silently. The page throbbed violently, letters twisting into symbols I could understand but could not name. The corridors beneath cities sprawling wider with each death, and the shadows leaned closer, shifting, approving, feeding, the wind carrying laughter that was not human. And I understood fully that 19 priests, 19 smiles, were part of a ritual older than humanity, and I had become its instrument. The 12th priest, Father Grayson, waited in a chapel on the far side of town, the air heavy, electric, alive with anticipation, the photograph forming immediately, him at the altar, faint smile, his eyes flicking toward me with recognition and inevitability. I whispered his name, my voice breaking, and he nodded, understanding the inevitability of what was about to occur. The knife in my hands moved with the book's guidance, the struggle short, intimate, and when it ended he fell, faint smile lingering, and I felt it fully, the presence, the thing behind the counting, the force that had chosen me, shaping reality, bending streets, folding shadows, watching, feeding, pulsing in rhythm with the book. I understood fully for the first time that this was no ordinary evil, no earthly malice, but a force ancient, patient, hungry, and that I had become a servant, a vessel, a hand carrying something the world was never meant to see. The 11th and 12th pages throbbed violently, letters twisting into shapes older than memory, corridors beneath cities, stairways that did not exist in the world above, faces frozen in eternal prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, and the laughter returned, soft, intimate, approving, and I knew fully that every step forward, every priest, every death was pulling me deeper, faster, towards something inevitable, and that once the 19th smile had been counted, there would be no return, the book alive, the city alive, and I trapped within it all, the presence watching, guiding, and the weight of what I had begun crushing me from the inside. The 13th priest, Father Langley, was hidden in a chapel whose windows had long been boarded, shadows pooling in corners like ink, the book pulsing in my arms, heavier than any weight I had known, and the photograph had already begun to form, him kneeling, lips moving in silent prayer, faint smile present. And I felt it again, that pull, guiding me forward, the knife in my hand moving as though it had a mind of its own, the struggle brief, intimate, inevitable. And when it ended, he fell. The page throbbed violently, letters twisting into symbols older than cities, corridors beneath the earth stretching further with each death, shadows shifting, feeding, counting, the laughter returning faintly, approving. The 14th priest, Father Moncrief, waited in a cathedral whose ceiling was so high it seemed to scrape the sky, the air thick with expectation, the photograph forming immediately, him at the altar, faint smile curling across lips, and I knew fully that each death was not just a tally, but a ritual, a step deeper into something ancient and insatiable. The knife moved in my hands, guided by the book, the struggle short, intimate, and when it ended, he lay still, the page filling with letters and shapes I could read, yet could not name, the corridors beneath cities growing, twisting, revealing secrets humanity had never been meant to see. The 15th priest, Father Calder, awaited in a chapel whose stone walls were cracked, shadows stretching unnaturally, the photograph forming instantly, him kneeling, hands clasped, faint smile already present, and I understood fully that the book had chosen me as a conduit, as a hand of something older than reason, older than the world, each death opening doors, folding streets, bending reality, and the knife moved with inevitability, the struggle brief, intimate, ceremonial, and when it ended, he fell. The page throbbed, symbols twisting, corridors lined with faces frozen in eternal prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, and the laughter returned, soft, intimate, approving, echoing through streets that no longer existed as I knew them. I realized fully that I had become more than human, a vessel, an instrument of a force that had been waiting, counting, smiling, feeding, the weight of 13, 14, 15 deaths pressing into my bones, the city itself alive, breathing, folding, whispering, and I understood with a terror that rooted in my chest that every step forward, every priest, every death was pulling me deeper into a darkness I could not escape. That the book, the shadows, the city and the presence behind it all were older, patient, insatiable, and that the final priests, the 19th smile, awaited, and I was already ensnared. By the time I reached the 16th priest, Father Abeline, the city had become something unrecognizable, streets folding, windows reflecting impossible shapes, shadows crawling along walls like living things, and the book pulsed in my hands, heavy, insistent, guiding me forward. The photograph forming before I even saw him kneeling, lips moving in silent prayer, faint smile already there, and I felt the pull, stronger than before, a force older than reason, older than the city, older than me. The knife lifted, moving on its own, brief, intimate, inevitable, and when it ended, he fell. The page thrumming violently, letters twisting into symbols I could read but could not name, corridors beneath the earth expanding, twisting, shadows shifting, feeding, counting. The laughter carried faintly on the wind. Approving, intimate, I moved on to the 17th priest, Father Malden. In a chapel hidden behind crumbling walls, the air thick with expectation, the photograph forming instantly, him at the altar, faint smile curling. I whispered his name, my voice shaking. He nodded, understanding the inevitability. The knife moved in my hands with the book's guidance, the struggle short, intimate, ceremonial, and when it ended, he fell. The page filled with letters and maps, corridors lined with faces frozen in prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, the presence behind all of it pulsing, counting, approving. The 18th priest, Father Ridley, awaited in a cathedral that smelled faintly of rot and old wax, the photograph forming immediately, him kneeling, lips moving, faint smile already there, and I understood fully that I was no longer human, that I had become a vessel, a conduit for a force older than cities, older than memory, older than the world itself. The knife in my hands moved inevitably, the struggle brief, intimate, inevitable, and when it ended, he fell. The page throbbed violently, letters twisting into symbols, corridors beneath cities stretching endlessly, shadows moving, feeding, laughter returning, soft, intimate, approving, echoing through streets that no longer existed as I knew them. And I realized fully that I had become part of a ritual older than humanity, that 19 deaths, 19 smiles, and this book had transformed me, reshaped the world around me, bent reality into something unrecognizable, and that the 19th priest, the final smile, awaited. And I was already caught in the orbit of something ancient, patient, insatiable, and inevitable. The 19th priest, Father Callahan, waited in a cathedral perched on the edge of the city, its spires piercing a sky heavy with storm clouds, the stone walls slick with shadows that moved of their own accord, and the book pulsed in my hands, heavier than ever, vibrating with anticipation, the final photograph forming before I even entered, Him standing at the altar, lips moving in silent prayer, a smile faint but unmistakable. The last smile I was to witness. I stepped inside, the air alive, pressing against me, the shadows leaning closer, bending, twisting, the streets outside folding into themselves, corridors appearing where none had existed, and I knew fully that this was the end, the culmination, the ritual older than humanity itself, the knife lifted in my hands, guided by the book, alive, inevitable, the struggle intimate, brief, preordained. And when it ended, he fell, the smile lingering, and I felt it fully, not just in my chest, but through the city, through the streets, through the shadows, the book pulsing violently, letters twisting into symbols older than memory, maps beneath cities, corridors lined with faces frozen in eternal prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, the presence behind it all revealed, vast, ancient, insatiable, counting the smiles, approving, laughing softly through the wind, the 1st through 19th all aligned, the ritual complete, the book heavier, alive, aware, and I understood fully, with a terror that rooted itself in my bones, that 19 deaths, 19 smiles, had opened something, freed something, reshaped reality around me, the city, the streets, the shadows, the air itself bending to a will older than reason, older than memory. And I was no longer human, no longer free, only a vessel, a conduit, a hand carrying the consequences of an ancient, patient force. The 19th page throbbed violently. Letters for me, and symbols I could read yet could not comprehend, corridors beneath cities expanding endlessly, faces frozen in eternal prayer, shadows shifting, moving, feeding, and the laughter returned, soft, intimate, approving, echoing through streets that no longer existed as I knew them, and I understood fully that I had become part of something unstoppable, inevitable, that the ritual had ended, and the world had changed in ways I could not undo. 19 priests, 19 smiles, and a presence older than time itself, counting, watching, waiting, insatiable. And I was trapped within it, a witness, a participant, a servant, unable to escape, unable to look away, knowing fully that nothing would ever be the same. The cathedral was empty when I left, the rain falling in sheets that made the streets shimmer like black glass. The book heavier than ever in my arms, its pages vibrating, alive with every death, every smile, every shadow that had shifted, moved, fed. And I understood fully that nothing would ever be the same. The city itself seemed altered, streets folding into impossible angles, buildings reflecting shapes that should not exist, and the wind whispered softly, carrying the faintest laughter, approving, counting, patient, insatiable. I walked through streets that no longer belonged to me, feeling the weight of 19 deaths, 19 smiles, 19 pages filled with symbols older than memory, corridors beneath cities stretching endlessly in ways my mind could barely comprehend, shadows moving at the edges of my vision, feeding, counting, watching. And I knew fully that the force behind it all had been revealed, and it had seen me, chosen me, shaped me into a vessel, a witness, a participant. I was no longer human in any meaningful sense. My reflection in puddles showed eyes too white, fingers blackened, movements almost inhuman, and the book throbbed violently, whispering promises of more, instructions of places I could not yet see, things I could not yet understand. The priests were gone, their smiles counted, the ritual complete, but the darkness had not ended. It had only expanded, stretching its fingers into every corner, every shadow, every quiet place, and I knew fully that I would never be free, that every step I took, every breath I drew, every moment I survived, the presence would be there, patient, insatiable, counting, smiling, shaping the world in ways I could barely perceive, the book heavy, alive, insistent. I placed it down briefly on a table, and it throbbed violently. Letters twisting, symbols forming, corridors expanding beneath the city, faces frozen in prayer, shadows shifting, and I understood fully that humanity would never know, would never understand, that 19 deaths, 19 smiles, had been only a small part of a truth too vast, too old, too insatiable to comprehend, and I felt the weight of the last priest, the 19th smile, echo through me like a bell of ice, and I knew fully that the world was different, the shadows longer, the streets folding, the wind carrying laughter that no one else would hear, and the book waited, patient, insatiable, counting, smiling, and I would carry it forward, a witness to a darkness older than reason, older than memory. 19 priests, 19 smiles, and the city, the shadows, the air itself forever changed, and I understood fully, with a terror that would never leave me, that the ritual had ended, but the presence had only begun.